We're burning about 1,000 square miles a day. Yesterday was 900 and odd. That's the size of a large city like Atlanta, Georgia. And we're still early in the fire season. The 2025 fires, when I was watching them, looked like they were very close to the 2023 record.
Guess what? Canada is on fire again. And that's the topic for today's show on the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. And today we'll be tackling a crisis that is all too sadly impossible to ignore. Canada's devastating 2025 wildfire season, though a season I think is maybe not even the right word, as some of these fires actually stay underground all year long. With over 200 active fires, millions of hectares burnt, and toxic smoke blanketing North America, these blazes are truly a stark reminder of the climate emergency we face. From Manitoba's record-breaking evacuations to the health risks of lingering smoke, we'll explore how climate change is fueling this inferno and what it means for our communities, our ecosystems, and our future. Join us as we unpack the science, the impacts, and the urgent need, as always, for action with our two experts that are here every week and happen to be from Canada, from the west and the eastern part of the Canada. So I'm happy to introduce first Dr. Peter Carter. Peter is a retired medical doctor in British Columbia. He's the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute. He's been an expert reviewer for the IPCC. And Peter, what's breathing like and living like in British Columbia these days with the wildfire season? Tell us what you're experiencing and your perspective on wildfires yet again.
Well, a couple of days ago, like 3 days ago, the wildfires, and you'll have read there was a lot of publicity on the actually unprecedented wildfires that blew up in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. 25,000 people at one point had been evacuated. So these were absolutely massive, uncontrollable, huge fires. But a couple of days ago, they didn't go out, but the fires switched to the west, and then they hit British Columbia by far the worst. For the past 24 hours, there's been a huge amount of areas burnt. The last one, yesterday, we had 13,500 square mile burnt. Now, that's in Canada, but pretty well all the Canadian fires are what we're seeing in British Columbia. So I'm doing my best to follow the fires using very good service, interagency Canadian fire observation resource. So they put the fires up every day, and on the 29th of May, the Canadian fires were 3,800 square miles, and as I told you yesterday, they're 13,600 square miles. Just imagine this. I mean, it's really, really very hard to imagine. We're burning about 1,000 square miles a day. Yesterday was 900 and odd. That's the size of a large city like Atlanta, Georgia. So that's every day. And we're still early in the fire season. And like 2023, that was that huge record, unbelievable fires in Canada. It just shot up many, many times the average of fires. The 2025 fires, when I was watching them, looked like they were very close to the 2023 record. Checking with the Canadian government, in fact, they are pretty well right on 2023 fires. So this isn't only appearing to be very bad, it actually is very bad. So what's so important about these? Well, the number one thing is the air pollution, right? Just like 2023, we've got air pollution tracking down to the mid United States. You've seen photographs of their cities. It's all gray. You can barely see them. And it's going right over to Europe and reaching over Russia. And I've posted some, unfortunately, rather dramatic satellite images of that. Absolutely unprecedented. There's never been anything like it. When I say highly toxic, they are toxic, damaging on an acute basis and also on a chronic basis once you've inhaled this stuff to all of our human systems, not just the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, the neurological system, and even increases cancer, of course. The next thing of why they are most important, of course, is carbon emissions. We are now able to track CO2 emissions and methane emissions. They're both emitted by burning fires. And that is really interesting and more than alarming because although some of the data is not quite the same over the years and the months, on CO2 emissions and methane emissions, we are up with 2023. So, with respect to emissions, this is absolutely, absolutely terrible. You may remember that in 2023, Canada's emissions were comparable to the emissions of India. Canada's emissions exceeded seven of the 10 largest national emitters. So, that's unfortunately seems to be what we're looking at. But of course, fires can change either way quite rapidly. So hopefully it's not going to be that bad. There's a long time to go. I do want to mention one quick thing. There was a very interesting research paper released early this year, and it was quite surprising because it found that the fires in the boreal region are increasing much faster than the fires south of the boreal.
Well, thank you, Peter. You presented, as you often do, because of the nature of the subject, some very sobering comments and observations. I think it's important to sort of set some context for what we're talking about today and what we talk about in most of our meetings, which is the fact that all of these phenomena, whether it's ice melting, record-breaking heat, fires, droughts, hailstones the size of cantaloupes or whatever, are a function of the fact that the Earth system basically has left or is leaving, depending on how you want to look at it, the Holocene era, the era that we've had for the past, I don't know how many decades or thousands of years, that has been a kind of sweet spot, if you will, not too hot and not too cold. And both humanity and every living being and every ecosystem has adapted to survive and indeed thrive within that Holocene range of temperatures. And as we emerge out of that into what many are calling the Anthropocene, we begin to have all of these unprecedented consequences, some of which we'll be enumerating today, but only a few because it would take us all day and night to enumerate all the consequences of wildfires. So that's sort of the context for our sort of microscopic review of Canadian wildfires. And with that, as always, I'm happy to introduce Paul Beckwith, who is at the other side of Canada in Ottawa, and he'll give us the Eastern Canadian perspective as well as your scientific perspective. Paul, as many of you know, is a climate system scientist and hosts a very popular YouTube program. He is indefatigable in presenting and posting detailed analyses of most of the major climate studies that come out of the scientific community. Paul, as always, welcome. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thanks, Herb. So I'm going to talk primarily about how you fight these wildfires, about water bombers. Canada is a world leader with water bombers. There was a good illustration or example of this with the LA wildfires. There were a couple of Canadian water bombers scooping up ocean water just off the beach, dropping it on the horrible fires in LA. And I think one of them actually collided with a drone and was grounded for a while. But, people used to pray for rain and run. We can do a lot better than that. The first water bombers in Canada were in these so-called H boats in something like the 1920s. H being hull boats. So these are basically amphibious aircraft. They can land on the water. Canada's backbone was called the Canadair CL 215. That was the original one, came out in the late 1960s, and we still use them, some of them today. It's a mainstay. They can hold 6,000 liters of water, and they don't actually just land on the lake. They maintain speed and skim across the water and scoop up water, and they can fill the more advanced CL 415, which came out to replace the older ones. They can fill up their 6,000-liter tank in about 12 seconds. While they're skimming across the water, they can do repeated drops in a day, up to something like 100 drops. If a lake is right next to a region where there's a wildfire, they can drop about 690,000 liters or so within one day on that fire. Bombardier stopped making them in 2015. Countries had what they wanted. There weren't a lot of orders, so Bombardier closed their manufacturing. They sold the rights to de Havilland, who built a new factory in Calgary in 2022, and they've been producing the newer model, the CL 415, which can hold 7,000 liters of water and takes about 14 seconds to fill up. The newer modernized water bombers they don't use metal tanks. They use composite material tanks to save 60 to 70% of the weight. They use non-corrosive materials in the tanks and the valves. Even engine parts and so on are going to non-corrosive metals, stainless steels, etc. So these are very reliable aircraft. They're a mainstay. The problem is the supply is very limited right now. So as I said, the Calgary plant, Canadian company, Calgary plant manufacturing them has a huge backlog. Wildfires were worse a few years ago in Europe. So, of course, European countries across the board put in huge numbers of orders for these aircraft. Peter's talked about the 2023 fires across Canada being horrible. Of course, a lot of provinces put in their orders for more water bombers at that time, and there's a huge backlog. So, for example, Manitoba ordered where a lot of the fires are going on right now, and so they put in an order for 3 of these new water bombers, but they won't get delivery till 2031, 2032. Ontario, I think we have something like 11 of the water bombers now, and we've ordered 6. And again, the delivery is after Manitoba. The thing is the deliveries are being done to many European countries now, as opposed to, it's first come, first serve, that's how capitalism and corporations work. So unless the Canadian government steps in and says we have a national fire emergency on our hand, they could jump the queue for the deliveries and just take these water bombers and say we need them in Canada right now. But they might be sued. I mean, there'd be legal issues. So, we're still not treating climate change like an emergency. This is just one company producing them. They can't make enough of them fast enough. I think Canada should get a national firefighting service, and these planes could be distributed and used in any area, rather than the red tape and having one that operates in one province going, to another province on the other side of the country. So, we need to do things differently and actually treat this climate crisis like the emergency that it is.
Thanks, Paul. They sound like remarkable inventions and technology. I can't even conceive of being able to take up that much water at one time and effectively deploy it to douse fires, or at least suppress fires as much as possible. Though I would guess you probably need a fleet of thousands to actually deal with the thousands of fires that are occurring now. And as I understand it, much of the policy in Canada and elsewhere is to basically leave these fires, not even try to douse these fires in many places because of their remoteness and because of the risks and the challenges in doing so. And of course, there's, I guess, some advantage in having them burn in terms of forest ecology, though that's probably outweighed by the consequences of such incredibly diverse and huge fires occurring all at once, as Peter just pointed out. Peter, I mean, if you were the advisor to the government in British Columbia or to the national government in Canada, other than what Paul suggested, which was to ramp up production of these fire bombers, what would you recommend be done that we're not now doing?
Well, I'd recommend that we stop increasing our greenhouse gas emissions and we stop accelerating global surface warming. It's very interesting that these fires are over the regions of global warming. Very dramatic. And also over the regions of drought. Canada is 55% in drought right now. So the regions of all these fires are in severe drought, and they've been in that for a long, long time. I just want to quote these numbers again. Yesterday, 13,600 square miles of forest burnt, mainly south of the Boreal. The day before, there was 12,700 burning, right? So we are looking at close to 1,000 square miles of Canadian forest burning every day. I compare it to 2023. Did anybody really, really get frightened or alarmed or panicky over what was happening in 2023? I don't think so. Certainly not the governments. And so here we go again. So the only answer is that damn it all, we have to do what the IPC says, and we have to stop global emissions. The IPC said it had to be stopped 2025 at the very latest. So long as we don't do that, all of this is going to get rapidly worse. Everything that is accelerating at present, and that's all the climate change indicators. And it looks like Canadian wildfires are now gone into an accelerating mode just over the past few years, because actually, since 1980, the Canadian fires sort of went up and down. They didn't change that much. But it's really, really worrying that the 2020s, we're seeing a very, very, very big difference. I mean, we're seeing a massive difference. For example, the amount of area that we're seeing burn already is 5 times the average area. We have all these really, really good agencies that do this for us. But unfortunately, I keep asking myself, what are we doing all this incredible monitoring for if it's not going to make a damn bit of difference? If we are just going to increase emissions, what are we doing it all for, right? So I think we need a lot of people jumping up and down and yelling and stuff like that. Oh, final point. Paul, you may be interested. I used to work in central Vancouver, in Port Alberni, and we had the two biggest water bombers in the world by far. Those were the Mars water bombers. Unfortunately, they've been retired now, but I had the pleasure of watching these scoop up unbelievable amounts of water from Throat Lake. But we still had to wait until the rain came.
Thank you, Peter. Your comment about we go through these crises and then nothing happens, whether it's fire or drought or winds or all the other biblical type plagues that climate change is going our way. And it reminds me one of the terms in my book, Climate Vocabulary of the Future, I call it sequential alarmism. The fact that we get alarmed when something happens, but because it's not constant, because it sort of has a beginning and an end, at least in the short run. So by 2 months later, we've sort of forgotten it, and policymakers forget about it because of all the other demands on their time and attention, which is obviously not meant to be an excuse, making excuses for their lack of action, but it's simply pointing out one of the insidious challenges of the climate crisis, that it's not in our face every single day, but it comes and goes. But each time it comes, the magnitude is greater and the impacts are more severe. With that, let me turn it back to Paul.
Yes, so I've come across a book by a local Ottawa author here. It's called Fire Eaters by Peter Pigeot, and he's an aviation author, and he's written about the history of these water bombers. I haven't got through it yet, but it looks like a very good read. The present crop of the most modern water bombers, the world is basically clamoring for these. And they're built, like I say, by one company in Calgary. They have great improvements over previous models, more powerful, fuel efficient engines. They're much lighter. They use a lot of composite materials, not just for the fuel tank or the water tank, but other parts of the aircraft. Just don't make a submarine out of the composite materials and try to go down to the Titanic. That doesn't work too well. The composite materials, of course, they don't corrode. There's a lot of stress on the water bomber, as you can imagine, when it lands and scoops up the water so quickly. So the materials, these are very, very rugged, reinforced aircraft. They've got very large engine size, so they can have heavy lift. They don't move that fast, but they're very versatile. They can do multi-mission roles, like even disaster relief, medevac. They're able to land on extremely rough water. So the hull design makes them more stable to do that. You couldn't do that with the older models. They have different coatings on the materials, and the scoops go deeper into the water to give them stability in rough water. Not all scuba divers like them. There's a well-known urban legend that some firefighters checking the ashes on a fire found some guy clad in scuba equipment in the middle of the forest, sucked up by the water bomber. But that's just an urban legend. That's not valid. They're very, very sophisticated equipment. And I told you, one water bomber can do 100 drops a day on a fire. That's 700,000 liters, and can make a huge dent. We detect these fires when they start from satellites. If we decide, let's put this out ahead of time, we can actually do it before the fires get out of control. It's just a matter of, coordination of them with the satellite information. I've already mentioned national sort of firefighting service. I mean, we need to do things differently to combat accelerating climate change. And these fires are going to be with us. I mean, it's not a fluke. We had one in 2023, record year, and now we're having yet another year. How many years is it going to take to wake up people? And when you just rely on commercial markets, and you just rely on a company producing them to meet demand, that's not really a plan by the government to address this problem. So we need to be smarter in the way we do things and use this amazing technology that the world is clamoring for.
Thank you, Paul. You pointed out the one book that you held up. I quote in my book an author by the name of Stephen J. Pine, who basically has written that our current age should be named the Pyrocene, not the Anthropocene so much. And he argues that, quote, the Earth's biota is disintegrating as much by tame fire's absence as by feral fire's outbreaks. And I guess what he means by that is that we're not allowing, in many cases, the natural fires that have occurred through millennia to occur. We suppress those, and that's in part one of the reasons why so much debris and other things build up. And anytime humanity intervenes in natural cycles, we learn the consequences. In the short run, we usually benefit from that, but usually, as someone once said, nature bats last, right? So, with that, I just want to ask before we wrap up, any last quick comments from either Peter or Paul?
So for those that are really, really, really interested in forest fires and global warming and climate change, I ended up finding what is the source, and it took me quite a while, and sort of nobody knows about it. It's called the Global Wildfire Information System, and this is satellite run. Copernicus and NASA and the EU Space Agency are combined on this. And we got the results from the last decade. And they're very different from the papers that are sort of all over the place in a way. There's no question from this data, which is from satellites. And again, it appears that satellite data is much more reliable than on the ground data, which is pretty weird. That's the place to go. GWIS, it's called.
Thanks, Peter. We'll definitely put that link in the program notes. Paul, any last thoughts?
We need wildfires. They're part of the natural cycle. After there's a wildfire, there's a lot. I mean, ash is a very good fertilizer. So the ash from a wildfire gets spread. And I'm just wondering whether that's affecting some of the local lakes near Ottawa, because weeds are horrible this year. The water temperature is warmer, but also if you get a layer of this ash on the surface, then that can cause algae growth and things. It's a nutrient. The soils in areas that did have a fire go through are very, very high in nutrients and so on. So we need a certain natural level, but we've gone overboard, and we're just saying if this fire is not affecting human lives, we're just going to let it burn, and then these things get out of control and they go to urban regions anyway. if there's high winds or wind shifts. So I think we need to be a lot smarter. We can use AI intelligently to help in predictions of where the fires are going and what we need to do about them, and coordinate the services of the available water bomber assets from all provinces, and use them in a smarter fashion. I mean, we got hit in, we maybe a wake up call in 2023. We haven't learned that much from 2023. It's only been a few years, but hopefully, after, with what's going on this year in light of 2023, hopefully we can get a national response to what's happening so that fewer people are losing their homes and livelihoods in towns, which is what we're going to be seeing going forward unless we actually take strong action against this. And there are things that we can do. We don't need to just pray and for rain and run, like I said at the beginning.
In addition to everything else, we still have to pray and run as well. It's unfortunately in some cases. I think it's fair to say that at least some of the explanation or the response of governments will depend upon how vigorous the citizens talk to their elected officials and remind them when fire season ends that fire season will begin again. And as I mentioned at the beginning, fire season actually doesn't end in many cases. It just goes underground with the so-called zombie fires. I read a quote recently that one climate scientist said for the first time in his life, he has now seen parts of Canada that have had not just one season of zombie fires, but two seasons, where essentially these fires have been multi-year now. And so, it's hidden from view, but it's an ongoing challenge. And I just want to end with a couple of questions, sort of rhetorical questions, but important questions. And maybe we'll do another program. And those of you watching this may have some comments in the chat. Can or should we even be thinking of replanting or reforesting some of these areas that are highly prone to fires? I've saw one paper recently that makes the case we shouldn't, that it will make climate change worse when there's a high probability that they'll just burn down again. It's one of those questions probably with no easy answer, but we should be focusing on. And the second thing gets back to what you were saying at the very beginning, Peter, the consequence of not reducing emissions rapidly enough and allowing temperatures, we're around 1.5 degrees C right now, depending upon how many years before and after we are now, we sort of take into account, but we're well on our way to 2 degrees C. And I've seen some papers that basically make the case that once we get at or beyond 2 degrees C, we may well be at the point where the boreal forests and maybe other forests around the world begin to become sources of carbon rather than carbon sinks. Right now, they capture and sequester any number of gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. And that is changing year by year, as Peter pointed out in 2023. But it may become a permanent phenomena where our forests are a source of the problem rather than a source of the solution. These are very challenging, very difficult, very serious potential consequences. And damn it, we don't have much time to deal with it. So that's why it's a climate emergency. That's why we come to you every week with the news of the day, the news of the year. We ask and hope that you will take some action on what you hear, talk to people, talk to policymakers, make changes in your life. And please, if you like this program, please like it on YouTube and tell your friends and neighbors about the program. There, go to our website, theclimateemergencyforum.org, subscribe to our channel, and basically become a climate emergency advocate. We need you, the world needs you, and as always, we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.